Nyali Banjalangi Rakol Jugun Nyali Gani Garama Mala Jugun.
I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, custodians of this Arakwal land on which we meet today, the Banjalang people. I would like to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I would like to extend my respect to the original people of this land. Welcome everybody to the inaugural Mullumbimby Pub Politics at the Courthouse Hotel. Tonight's theme is the future of capitalism, democracy and activism in Australia, something that I think is pretty close to all of our hearts in this shire. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers tonight. Democracy theorist activist Professor Lyn Carson from Sydney University and leading environmental activist Aidan Ricketts from Southern Cross University. Thank you both for coming to our town. Would you please welcome to the stage for the inaugural Nagara Institute Pub Politics, Dr. Richard Hill.
There's a doctor in the house. The Nagara Institute, in fact, is made up of a whole number of people, a most remarkable group of local people. Our intention, ultimately, is for the Nagara Institute to occupy the space that is currently occupied by those really nasty little think tanks, funded usually by nasty little corporations or nasty large corporations, for us to get a voice on the national and international stage. What is the Nagara Institute? What are we for and what are we against? Well, we are unequivocally, unashamedly against neoliberalism and corporate capitalism. Neoliberalism is, as Noam Chomsky said recently, is a byword for massive inequality, for corporate domination of the world, for wealth and income to be gathered amongst a few. And we really oppose that, and what we particularly oppose is the corporate greed that is leading to planetary destruction on a huge scale. These people have to be stopped, the power has to be addressed, and my view, along with many other people, is that organisations at a local level, these sorts of gatherings are pivotal and vital to bringing about social change. So good on you for being here. So we're against them, so what are we for? What we're interested in this series, which we've got coming up, and we've got a fantastic series of speakers running throughout the year, the fourth Wednesday of every month. What they're going to be talking about, what this ideology and the institutions and the power interests, what the results of this are in terms of generating massive inequalities around the world and perpetrating enormous harm on millions and millions of people. This forum is absolutely crucial in developing not only an intellectual space so we can share and exchange dialogue and ideas, but it's really also important in terms of conveying our opposition to neoliberalism and corporate capitalism, because this event is going to be filmed and placed on a Nagara YouTube channel to spread the message of today, to propagate our arguments to a wider audience. Think Tank Watch is going to be an initiative which monitors and chronicles and responds to and reacts to the outpourings of right-wing think tanks in Australia. Now, the one thing we do know about right-wing think tanks is they're absolutely intimately connected to corporate interest. We know that in the United States in particular, but we know it in Britain, in Canada, and certainly in Australia. They are funded by corporations. I heard, before I came here this evening, I heard a really interesting debate in the Senate about political donations. This is a corrupt system that allows corporations to buy off governments to maintain their interests. We have to oppose this. Thanks very much.
Our first guest speaker is Professor Lyn Carson. Carson, as she prefers to be called, is a professor in applied politics at the University of Sydney Business Education Unit. Carson has been involved in many projects connected with deliberative democracy and is currently director of the New Democracy Foundation. She has helped establish Australia's first consensus conference, Australia's first 2 deliberative polls, Australia's first citizens' parliament, numerous citizens' juries and community summits, and a host of other public engagements related to public policy or exploration and improvement at local, state and national levels. Mullumbimby, please welcome to the stage, Carson.
What a rousing introduction and welcome. One thing that Sally didn't mention was that I was also at a period as an elected representative, and I know some of you from that period. And that period, those 4 years on local government, changed the way that I view the world. There are 3 very important principles. The first is that the people who are making the decisions should be randomly selected. We use stratified random selection, so that what we get is a little microcosm of a population. So we would randomly select from the entire town of Mullumbimby, and the people that would come into the room would look like Mullumbimby. They would look like the people that you see on the streets of Mullumbimby. They probably wouldn't be you, because I suspect there are a lot of activists in the room. Activists have a different role in these methods. They're usually called citizens' juries, policy juries, people's panels, and so on. Activists come in trying to convince that little miniature population of their position. The people in the room making the decisions are simply citizens, everyday citizens. But they don't just come into the room for an hour or 2. They come into the room for as much as 40 hours. They are deeply informed. They choose who to hear from. They hear from experts, from the right, from the left, from everywhere in between. So that's the first principle, representativeness or inclusion. It has to look like your population. The second principle is deliberation, which is why it's called deliberative democracy. So these people are together for 40 hours and they are deeply informed. They have a neutral facilitator. Some of those facilitators are in the room now. And those people allow the group to find its own way. 40 hours of hearing from experts, 40 hours of discussing, weighing up strengths and weaknesses of various options, making recommendations. That's the second principle. The third principle, and it's the one at New Democracy that we hold very dear, is influence. There's no point in getting this miniature population, bringing them into a room for 40 hours, having them deeply informed, having them make the most extraordinarily good recommendations, and then the decision maker says, well, I don't like that decision. So we only convene these methods now if we have a guarantee from the decision maker that that decision maker will act on those recommendations. And surprisingly, they do. Some of the projects that we've done, the most recent one was Melbourne City Council, where a randomly selected group came together and deliberated on a 10-year budget worth $4 billion. That group made decisions about how the council should make choices about services, what it should cut, what it should increase, and the council is now acting on those recommendations. This is not a one-off event. They are happening all over the world. They're sometimes called citizens' assemblies. That most recent event where same-sex marriage was suddenly on the agenda as a legislative possibility in Ireland came about through a deliberative forum like the one that I'm just talking about. In Mullum, you've got a neighbourhood centre that's convening community conversations, and out of those conversations come issues, ideas, possibilities. Those ideas should be going to a citizens' jury. The citizens' jury should be making the decisions in collaboration with the council. If you bring a group of people into the room, you want as diverse a group as possible. Not a group of experts, a group of uneducated, educated, highly educated, young people, middle-aged, older. You will get a better outcome if you have a diverse group. It's a very important part of the work that we do. We could be lobbying the federal government, of course, to have a randomly selected upper house. Now, if they're serious about the upper house, and I've been hearing it all week, that it should reflect the will of the people, what better way to represent the will of the people than to have a randomly selected upper house that is a genuine house of review with oversight of the lower house? Otherwise, we're going to end up with a Senate that is a rubber stamp for the lower house, and I don't think that's a good way to go. So in closing my remarks, I just want to say that deliberative democracy, for me, is a way of avoiding what I see as a terrible drift towards alternatives to representative government. By the way, I don't think we have a democracy, I think we have an oligarchy, so I tend to call it representative government. But if we don't have a genuine shift towards more genuine democracy, I fear for our future. I fear for totalitarianism, I fear for any kind of autocracy. We only need to think about Donald Trump for 30 seconds and you know that I'm right. Thanks for listening to me.
Aidan Ricketts is an activist, educator, academic and author of The Activist Handbook, a step-by-step guide to participatory democracy. In addition to running activist training courses around the country, including an accredited course at SCU, Aidan is currently involved in the campaign against CSG mining. Please give a warm, warm welcome to Aidan Ricketts.
One of the most wonderful things that I think a study of a complexity approach, or even we could call it an ecological approach in some ways to social change in politics, is the realisation actually that the status quo is the most vulnerable thing that there is. To me, that's sort of something that gives me a hell of a lot of enthusiasm, even optimism, because the traditional leftist view of things is that the status quo is this massive, powerful monolith, and that our task as activists or social change agents is to first smash the status quo and then create the new society. And I think that binary, that understanding has disempowered us, has frustrated us, and worse still, has made us fight amongst ourselves. So programmatic thinking is that thinking that goes, the status quo is a great big monolith and history is some sort of linear process, and what we need to do first is smash the status quo, and after we've done that, then we build a new society. Now that's, fairly familiar thinking to, fairly traditional Marxism. Another way of looking at programmatic change, which is slightly different, is that whole process of political parties, elections and representative democracy. And the idea, okay, we want to change the world. First we'll form a new political party, and they start yawning. Then we'll work and work and work until we get into a position where we can influence the power holders or seize government ourselves, and then we'll change the world, okay? Again, a very programmatic strategy. Now those are sort of the grand ones, but even in the sort of social change work that I do, and particularly the work of large NGOs, there's still this enormous addiction to programmatic change processes because donors tend to like them. If you can come up with a document that looks a bit like a corporate plan that says, well, what we're going to do about this problem is we're going to do this, we're going to raise people's awareness there, then we're going to have this will happen by December, and we've got some great big linear plan with all of these kind of KPIs along the way that we can measure. Those things look good. Donor organisations or donors tend to like that, and they'll pay money for those. When you go along and say, okay, look, what we're going to do is we're going to be non-linear. We're going to just look at all of the conditions as they are, and we're going to assess the target, work out where its vulnerabilities are, and then we're just going to start nipping at its heels so that it has to respond. They sort of go, I'm not sure I'm going to give my money to that. But in actual fact, that's probably a short and dirty version of what I sort of see as really, really working. So instead of seeing the status quo as this monolithic thing that first we have to destroy the status quo and then we build a new society, we begin to see the status quo as this incredibly vulnerable thing, because everything about this universe tells us that the minute you have a status quo, it begins to degrade, it gets subjected to entropy, it has change forces coming at it from all over the place. So what you begin to do as nonlinear change agents is go, well, what are all those forces for change? What are those greatest vulnerabilities of the status quo? And there's not necessarily just one status quo. We might have nested status quos. It depends, are we trying to deal with patriarchy or capitalism or the complex of patriarchy and capitalism, or are we simply worried about the fossil fuel industry? Obviously, we're going to pick, targets at different levels and look at them. And when you think about that, what are you trying to do? You're going to try to become the next status quo after you've got rid of this status quo. Because I can tell you that if you have your revolution and you take over and you become the new status quo, people like me will become your enemy on the next day. Because I'll go, oh, you're the next new status quo and look at all the contradictions you have. Let's start nipping at you and dismantling them. The whole point of nonlinear change is that you're not searching for the one true revolution. You're not searching for the one proper outcome or the one way we're going to do this. You really see social change as a garden that has enormous different species growing in, similar to a rainforest. And where there's a gap of light, they all compete. And the one that goes ahead is the one that just had the most going for it. I mean, I often think about, all our wonderful hippies playing with solar power in their shacks out in the bush over all those years. It could have just been a marginal experiment, but then as time would have it, we have a carbon crisis, and suddenly all of that thinking and all of that innovation activists, in a sense, were doing around solar power has become absolutely essential to the whole planet. So we never know which one of our social change experiments are going to be the ones that really take off. And I think that's where we see the real power. I see programmatic change strategies, they do have their place. The union movement, the Labor Party, throughout from the 1920s onwards in particular, were fairly successful in their programmatic strategies. But we need to remember that programmatic strategies work best in very stable historic circumstances. And hands up anyone who thinks we're in stable historic circumstances at the moment. We're certainly not. We're in extremely chaotic times. So any system that depends on staged processes where we can predict outcomes is going to be problematic. The other thing that you get from programmatic change is this obsession with success and failure. Are we succeeding? Are we failing? Is capitalism surviving despite us? Oh my God, the corporations are getting bigger. And there's all this sort of disempowerment that comes from this success and failure thing, whereas I sort of turn around and go, hey, there's no end point to history. There's actually no point where we get to decide whether we succeeded or failed. Don't worry too much about success and failure, because things are probably getting simultaneously better and worse all the time. And as activists, you're going to be doing it for your whole life, and if you're silly enough to reincarnate, you're going to be doing it for 1,000 years. So just get used to the fact that it's an ongoing struggle, and what you really need to do is be an opportunistic dog, sort of nipping at its heels and provoking change. Nonlinear change always proceeds from the historic present, or the eternal present, if you like. And certainly I've found meditating really helps me get into these things, to sort of go, look, the only thing I can do about life is accept things as they currently are and then find a resourceful way of making change. Whether that's my personal life or whether that's the grand political situation or a diversity of political situations across the planet, it's really all you can do. So wringing our hands about Rupert Murdoch having control of the media, or whether Donald Trump's just got elected or something, those things are frightening. But we can't just drop our bundle. We just go, oh well, that's the new situation. Where are the opportunities? What can we do? And in that sense, nonlinear change works a little bit very much more empirically, I believe, than programmatic change, because at every moment we sort of take this MRI slice of reality, say, all right, how bad and good is it? What can we do about it? Let's try something. And then in a few months' time, we'll come back and see which of the things we did worked, which things didn't work, what's changing, what are the new circumstances. Values unite, outcomes divide. We can sit around and argue about the outcomes we want. Nobody's asking them for us. But if we sit around and work out what are the values that motivate us, it's amazing how quickly we find unity. And when we locate the values that motivate us, they're contagious. They're contagious to other people, and we start forming like great big magnetic clusters. We form big social groups, we form big campaigns. And if we stick on that conversation, it's very easy for people to buy in and to start agreeing with us. So I'm really into sort of promoting a values framing. And we saw that and we were applying a lot of this stuff at Bentley and in the gas campaign, incidentally. The values campaigns was what we wrapped it around. You saw how magnetic it was for people to come in and join in those values. So think always values, values, values. Values stop us fighting with each other. Values bring other people in, and values stop us having to worry too much about what the outcomes are going to be, because part of the delicious blindness of sort of a complexity approach is that what we're actually moving towards is unspecified future states. And it's strategic in that you're always able to very, very opportunistically align yourself with the entropic forces which are currently snapping at the heels of your target. If you look at how the coal and gas campaign is sort of my favourite example for the moment, because I'm in it, and because I've been really happy to watch how it's done that. You know, it's working with the economics of coal, the economics of gas. It's working with communities. It's attracting farmers and Indigenous people and a whole range of people through values-based framing. And it's a very, very amorphous network. It's not controlled by the big NGOs. It works very much on this quite messy, locally autonomous model. But you've seen how powerful it is. The thing that sort of really inspires me with nonlinear change is it makes us all free. We can pursue an enormous range of different experiments, an enormous range of different things. We don't have to fight amongst ourselves with that's not the one true path, that's not the true revolution. You'll be first up against the wall when it comes, or someone else will be. Because in a way, I'm not sure that kind of revolution's coming. I mean, I see environmentalism and feminism as some of the most amazingly powerful non-linear social movements, you know, of the century, and they've been amazingly transformative so far, and they'll continue to go on and transform things. But whether they're actually going to completely smash capitalism or smash patriarchy and then create a new thing, I don't think they will. I think what they do is they continuously force the status quo to adapt. And what complexity tells us about adaptation is that a status quo is always faced with change strain, entropic forces. And it only has two choices. It can adapt, and if it adapts, it moves towards its opponent effectively by adapting towards it, by making the changes that are being asked of it by change agents, or it resists, which is what fascism and totalitarianism does, and it calcifies. When it adapts, it sets in chain a butterfly effect motion in which it's never quite sure which of those changes are going to lead to more changes and more changes and more changes. When it calcifies, it gives itself this temporary resistance, but that's not a resilient resistance. What that actually does is accelerate it towards the moment of its abrupt collapse. So we see, you know, totalitarian regimes like the Soviet Union tend to bumble along until they reach a critical point of collapse, whereas we see adaptive regimes able to adapt. Now that gets me back to capitalism. Why capitalism has always been so damn frustrating for the left has been that for all of its warts and all of its horror, it's actually a pretty clever, complex adaptive system. And that's something we've got to sort of take in a little bit deeper and go, so that's why it was able to sell Che Guevara cola. You know, that's why it will sell you the rope to hang it with at the same time as marketing punk rock. It's been very, very hard for us to smash it. And we may not be, you know, the program may not be to smash capitalism, it may be to constantly, cleverly and opportunistically force it into either adaptive or resistive states. And as it goes into adaptive states, it'll move towards the changes we're wanting. If it goes into resistive states, and remembering we're not controlling how it's responding to us, if it goes into resistive states, it accelerates its own eventual abrupt shift. Climate change is kind of a microcosm of that that's happening right in front of our eyes. We're seeing the whole fossil fuel empire, we're seeing the global economy, the global ecosystem moving to the edge of chaos, and we're seeing that incredible battle between adaptation and resistance. The fossil fuel industry would have us deny it, pretend it's not there, continue subsidising, and yet we've got these incredible forces of change, and not all of them are activism. Suddenly there's new capitalisms, like the new capitalism of, you know, Tesla and so on, and renewable energy, that are actually, you know, possibly doing them more damage than the activists, and then the activists adapting to that. And I think that's the beautiful thing. It really encourages us and gives us that empowerment to go back to that. And if you get in one of those arguments with people saying all this stuff you people are doing is all pointless, what you need to do is smash that and then replace it with this, sort of go, Yeah, well, you go ahead and do that. I'm growing these trees over here, you know, because I really see it. It really is like a rainforest or growing in a patch of sunlight, where we've all got to engage in experiments. They're all worth something. We don't know which ones are going to be the ones that really take off. So if I had to get to my 3 things, because I'll finish up here, is participate freely, participate from your values, whatever it is that really you see as your contribution to making the world a better place, get into it and participate. Secondly, it's a great idea to, and an easy passive form of resistance, to look at the things you're contributing to that you don't have to. So certainly the divestment campaigns, withdrawing your support from the things you don't support is also a good and easy thing to do. And other than that, I'd sort of say, get down to your values, find out what the values are that motivate you, and in your conversations with people everywhere you go, and in your media releases and in your organisations, always be communicating your values frame. Because one of the things we've learned, you don't change people's mind with persuasive argument. Some people you do, but most people you don't. They just sort of back up and think of all the reasons why they don't agree with you. But if you can show people that they already share some of the values that you share, then they're already sort of moving towards you, and it's much easier to expand out from there. So that's my 3rd one. Contact your own values. Why are you the sort of person that wants to make these changes in the world? Once you've answered that, stop trying to convince people of anything and just tell them, I'm the sort of person that wants to make these changes in the world. These are the things I care about. And that's the really seductive stuff that really pulls people together and builds powerful social movements.
So although one needs reasons for being an activist, basically you want to change something, why do we have to think that it's all going down the gurgler right now?
I actually agree. I don't think we have to start with a negative. I don't think, you know, fear is the only motivator. And that's what I like to say to people is actually let's stop asking, are things getting better? Are things getting worse? Are we winning? Are we losing? Because in order to answer that, we'd have to know, you'd have to be near the end of history. And I don't think hopefully there isn't an end of history. And if there is, we're going to be very sorry. Well, we might get a chance to be sorry about it. But yeah, but I agree. We don't have to start with the negative, but I sort of don't think I was assuming that. I was sort of just talking about, you know, how chaotic do we think it is at the moment, on the basis that if you're going to adopt those programmatic strategies, they work well when things are stable for a period. But if you are in a period of chaos, then it's better to be a lot more flexible.
My interest is, what is the very next step? What are we going to do, like tomorrow? What's happening to get this show rolling? Because we know where we're going, we're here together. How do we take the very next step?
You know, I think we all need to trust our values and our wisdom and just get enthusiastic about it. I mean, one of the things I like to say about people is that the beautiful thing about a life of activism, however we define activism, is that it's a life well lived, because, you know, what do you do with your energy after you've, you know, got food, secured your family or whatever? It's the best, most useful and most gratifying thing you can do, because happiness comes from being part of something bigger than yourself. So I sort of really like to just encourage people to go, look, find a sustainable way to be an activist and do it every day for the rest of your life, because it's the best thing you can be doing anyway, and just go for it.
Let us all develop some skills in relation to critical thinking. You know, let us all begin to ask, what assumptions are you making? You know, is that true in all circumstances? Start to interrogate a situation, look for the evidence, become the critical thinkers that we need to be in order for the quality of our public talk to improve.
I'm an activist. I'm involved in I guess like an anti-war group. How do you keep going? What gives you hope and what keeps you going along this path?
Thanks for that. I think the short answer is giving it a nudge, because, you know, ending war or ending poverty or any of those things, you know, they are very, very big asks, and you're not necessarily going to see your outcome. I was talking to a peace activist the other day, and it surprised me. She said, "Oh, but the greatest disappointment to us was we had those huge rallies before the Iraq War, and they were the biggest rallies in human history, and yet they did nothing." And I was sort of like, no, they didn't do nothing. For a start, they were the biggest rallies ever in human history. you're the biggest. So by virtue of that, you're the biggest social movement ever. You know, in terms of feet on the street. The fact that the war happened anyway is not proof that that was a failure. I think the fact that we had the biggest rallies ever in human history against the Iraq War is a fantastic thing, a fantastic success, because it shows the growth of that tree in the garden of human history. There haven't been rallies against war that big in the past. The fact that the leaders belligerently went ahead with the war plan they'd already come up with, well, they tend to do that. They tend to do that, A, because that's what they were going to do anyway, and B, because to be seen to stop in the face of a social movement is an even bigger back down. If you pull back from the linear view of what you're doing, you stop really asking, are we succeeding or are we failing? You might ask, are we growing? Or are we causing any change? And you probably are causing change. I mean, how do you know what the reluctance of major governments to go to war would be if not for the peace movement?
I think any system, randomly selected system, I think could be open for corruption. So I don't know whether you thought about that, whether how that could be implemented.
One of the great advantages of a citizens' jury is that it's a one-off event, it's over a short, concentrated period, and I think for that reason it's not vulnerable to corruption. There is typically no vote, so it's not like you can buy a vote from a juror, because what they're aiming to do is to explore common ground, and they see how far they can get. They start with values, by the way, in the same way that Aidan talked about, but then it's an exploration of what do we agree on, and they keep building on that agreement. And if they can't agree on something, there's always a minority report that goes alongside what they do agree on, which I like. In the very short time that I was an elected representative, we spent 90% of the time arguing on the 10% that we disagreed on. It used to drive me crazy. And I would say, can't we talk about the 90% that we agree on and we can build on that? No, let's just have an argument about the 10% we disagree on, and that doesn't happen in these deliberative forums.
But when it comes to political parties, I mean, is the problem that political parties aren't being pragmatic enough, or is the problem that they're being too pragmatic? I think get back to values, and I'm sure we'd all be a lot more happy with our political parties if they would articulate their values and they would act from their values.
Given that human values are probably the basis, and they're a social basis for communities and ergo political systems, why then is capitalism the dominant system that we have?
What's that one?
In one sentence or less.
One sentence or less. Capitalism per se is not a problem for me. It's when it's uncontrolled that I have a problem with it.
One of the things that's utterly corrupted capitalism is corporations. Originally designed capitalism, and if you actually go back to some of the early writings like Adam Smith and so on, they would have been horrified to think that it got taken out of the hands of human entrepreneurs and put in the hands of large collectives. Even liberalism tended to very much centre itself around the moral fibre of the individual and be very afraid of collectives. So it's very odd that the liberal capitalist model has actually allowed itself to be taken over by corporations, which are actually bureaucracies rather than individuals, even though they get artificially treated by the law as individuals. They're actually corporate bureaucracy. And a terrible sort of trick of morality and values has occurred. But unfortunately what we did is then created this Frankenstein monster called the corporation, which is entirely self-interested, acquisitive and competitive. And then that bureaucracy, that actual collective bureaucracy, which is immortal and undemocratic, has come up and started to dominate our system. So, you know, some of the early faith of capitalism was you pour in all of humans' needs and all of humans' desires and values, and the machine shakes and wobbles and makes a whole lot of funny farting noises, and what pops out at the other end is the collective human desire. And unfortunately, the entities which are actually feeding those choices into that machine are no longer necessarily humans, they are corporations, which are these money-seeking entities which actually don't have a morality, which don't have a soul, and which are effectively amoral. And I think a lot of our disease of capitalism is that. I mean, one of the things, I'm not a great defender of capitalism. The thing I'm impressed at is that it's a complex adaptive system and it can be adaptive. What it has, though, is deeply flawed algorithms. The algorithm of perpetual growth and the algorithm of corporations are two of the great cancers that are making it become the problem that it is. They're not mortal, they're not human, they have no souls, they're not born of the dust and the genes of this planet that we share with all the other species. They really are money-making bureaucracies.
Once they start getting the picture that these corporate machines that you were talking about, Aidan, are threatening jobs, threatening democracy, threatening the environment, threatening our health, there is a coming together. There's a coalition building like I've never seen before. That's what gives me great hope. I'm part of that, and I wonder what you both think about it.
You know, in the past, the right saw themselves as the sort of evidence-based pragmatists and the left as the ideologues, and particularly in the sort of the heavily Marxist era, there was a very strong sort of ideological dogma in the left, and then the left has gone through a bit of a collapse of that dogma and a whole lot of soul-searching, and the right believed that it had won history, which is always a mistake, believed that it had won history and withdrew into its own dogmas. And I think in the last 20 years we've emerged into a space where the right is all about dogma and not evidence, and the left has become it's become fragmented, which if you're being evidence-based you will be fragmented because the world is complex. The left has become necessarily fragmented, necessarily pragmatic and evidence-based. I just want an economic system that's consistent with basic physics. That's as evidence-based as it can get, you know. I don't want to live on a finite planet where they think the economy can grow endlessly 4% every year, okay? And when you get to that, you realise, wow, the actual evidence-based argument is very much with the left, and the right has disappeared not only into dogma, but into a pyramid scheme.
What's coming upon us is not going to take very long. We can talk about all this, but one day something is going to happen here, as it has happened in history, and there's a power that is using communism and capitalism just for a cynical purpose. Have you thought about that?
Well, I've thought about many things. One of the things I've found funny in the last few years is, well, it doesn't look like it now, but when China seemed to be winning the monopoly game was that the communists were winning the game of capitalism, but perhaps that's not so pleasing. But look, I agree, but we've got to be careful of sort of any kind of end of history views. I mean, history's going to keep going on, and we've always faced crises, we've always faced oppressors, we've always faced big empires, and we're facing another one. And I think corporations, more than capitalism, are the problem. They are extremely powerful, but like any status quo, like any powerful regime, they are going to have their vulnerabilities, and our job is to sneak in there and find out what those vulnerabilities are. And their vulnerabilities are fairly significant. They do depend on human-created legal systems for their very existence, so that's a pretty key vulnerability. They do, at this stage, depend on humans to carry out most of their functions, and they need those humans to be obedient. I do worry a little bit when Stephen Hawking tells us to worry about artificial intelligence. I do worry about corporations getting hold of artificial intelligence and starting to be able to run themselves without humans. But look, you know, like I say, I just think history's always been a struggle, it always will be. We've got to sort of get neither utopian nor apocalyptic, but remain really practical, where we say, which bit of history have I landed in today? What does it look like? What's the most pragmatic thing I can do? You know, we've got to unlock those. I mean, for me, I did a whole thesis on unlocking the idea that the corporation is a person. You know, I went to great, mentioned it before, went to great effort to show they don't have a moral faculty, people do. The whole philosophy of liberalism, even conservative liberalism, is about the human moral faculty. And if you can just show to liberals that corporations lack the very thing that all of your philosophy is based on, you're beginning to fuck with their algorithm, which is a really, really good way to start to dismantle things constructively. I'm not sure it'll succeed, but it's the powerful way of doing things.
I actually think there is a possibility there that we have not conceived of. China hates Western democracy. It actually thinks that it doesn't work. It also has a real problem with corruption at the local level. And it may surprise you to hear that China is actually experimenting with participatory budgets and deliberative polls in some of the regions at that lower community level. So who knows? China may come up with a democracy that is devoid of major parties, which is the problem that they have, the two-party system. Maybe something exciting might come out of it. If I think about a non-linear change, it may come from a very unexpected place. So, yeah.
Professor Lynn Carson and Aidan Ricketts.